Thanks everyone for being here with us today. As you may know, and as Simone just explained, I am an exhibitor here at TEFAF, and I'm an antiques dealer. So I'm the first person interested into the conversation we're about to have about how objects of the past can find their place in contemporary interiors, both theoretically and practically. And I'm absolutely delighted to have a panel that represents all those different layers of how we think about this mix, this concept of placemaking, which we're about to dive into. And I'm going to introduce briefly our three guests today, from my right to my left. All the way over there, Michael Diaz Griffith, who's Executive Director and CEO of the Design Leadership Network, who was also formerly Executive Director of the John Soane Museum and worked for the Winter Show in New York, so a very multi-layered experience in the interiors and decorative arts professional world. And Michael, we'll talk about this later, has also published a great book called New Antiquarians that focuses on younger collectors who, exactly like what we're going to talk about today, mix old and new together. Then in the middle of the sofa, Jeong, who comes from the Rosewood Hotel Group, and who is the Vice President of Design, and who leads this global design direction for the entire group of making sure each hotel has its own identity, but also has a homogeneity that Rosewood comes with. And we're going to explore further the design philosophy of Rosewood in particular. From deploying furniture making and glass blowing during her time at the Rhode Island School of Design, which is an absolutely fantastic school from what I heard, to helping lead regional expansion at Chanel. Jeong, you, from what I understand, like art history and crafts and multidisciplinarity. And here on my right, Francis Sultana, who also is someone you will run into at TEFAF quite a lot, who's an interior and furniture designer, artistic director and CEO of David Gill Galerie. And he will present to us, from what I understand, particularly his own interior and how his philosophy of mixing old and new comes to life in his practice. But I always think that those talks are better introduced when we have a little visual to help us dive into this. So I asked our three panelists here today as a kind of rapid fire question to provide us with an interior that mixes old and new. That's one of their main inspirations. So if we can start with you, Jeong, and the image that you picked today.
Sure. So I wanted to bring in an image from Asia. This is the Jim Thompson house in Bangkok in Thailand. And what inspires me about, I think any space is really, it's about storytelling. And when I look at, when you enter the Jim Thompson house, you feel there's a mystery and sort of mystique about the place. I mean, Jim Thompson was an architect. There's all these speculations that he was a spy, his mysterious disappearance sort of in the 60s as well. But the way that he sort of collected, the Jim Thompson house is made up of 6 teak houses that he sort of collected and built, but bringing in all sorts of things from furniture, antique sculptures, paintings, but also infusing kind of other eclectic mixes of Italian marbles in the foyer of the entrance, Belgian glass, Victorian chandeliers, all sort of coming together in this really interesting sort of eclectic space that he actually lived in as well.
Well, I think that does epitomizes our topic for the day. Next is Francis's choice.
Yeah, this is a salon of Yves Saint Laurent, Pierre Berger. I think I was always fascinated by these two men as being the masters of collecting in Paris, especially in the 1970s and 80s. And this salon really paid homage to the Art Deco, to really at a time when the market was emerging of the importance of the 1920s, 30s. They were pioneers in this time of collecting. And their vision really of what they purchased had no bounds, the quantity and the quality. I remember when it was the great sale in Paris in the Grand Palais, was the most eeriest of feelings because it was totally different to going to TEFAF now. But everything again was for sale. And you saw two people's lives of collecting. And this salon, for me, epitomizes a vision of two people who live to collect. And their passion was all about that. And it was so diverse. And they made many a career. If you imagine Claude Lalande, for instance, the Salon of All the Mirrors was done many, many years ago. It's only at that time of the auction that Lalande suddenly became going from beautiful, decorative, applied artists in the realm of a stratosphere of higher value. And certain collectors can do so much. And that's why, for me, even from when I was very young, they were a great influence in style and chic and elegance and a vision. And collecting is all about vision, which is something that actually I experience every time I come to TEFAF. So it's really, for me, a very important room that I selected for me.
To finish with Michael's choice.
And this, of course, is Sir John Soane's Museum in London, a place very dear to me, but as I travel the world and attend events like TEFAF, I learned that it's so important to so many people who've had these wonderful private moments at the museum, which is often very quiet, not always very trafficked. And I think it functions as a sort of temple of beauty for visitors to London, and especially those who are interested in collecting. But I knew that we would be looking at the interiors of some connoisseur collectors today. 20th century interiors, Francis, I class you among that group of connoisseur collectors who live with antiques and art in the most beautiful way. And I thought this would provide a sort of analog from the past that can also tell us something about how we can project these practices into the future, because while this space looks very historic, and indeed, of course, it is now, it represents the cutting edge of contemporary architecture at the time it was built. Soane really pushed the classical vocabulary to the outer edges of what it could be. He did wonderfully inventive things with his treatment of space and light, reduction to sort of frame what was his great collection in the space. So we see someone who is collecting antiquities and also plaster casts of antiquities. So there's a message here about accessibility, I think. He's designing a space around the collection. And there's a wonderful dialogue between the collecting practice and the architecture, which are really a part of the same movement. And I think that has a lot to tell us about how we can practice today. It's not just about, bringing beautiful objects into historic environments. I love that approach. But it's also very compelling for me to think about how, even in the context of contemporary architecture, can we build in a new way, in a visionary way, around old things that creates a dynamic dialogue.
And I think that you selected also a second very different picture.
I did, because I sensed that we would be looking at very layered, sort of eclectic interiors today. And so I featured this shot of Adolf Loos's bedroom for his wife Lena from 1903. I mean, I just love sort of Vienna 1900 and everything about it. So it's a sneaky way of giving into that obsession. But what I think is important here is you have a very reduced sort of white box of a room, which is analogous to the type of space that many of us have to deal with in the 21st century. And instead of conceiving it as a space upon which to project, layers of paneling or decorative treatments, he has engaged with the history of decoration in a very reduced way, but he has by, of course, creating this beautiful drapery around the room. And so while it's not filled with historic reproductions of sort of interior architecture from the past, while it's not filled with objects at all, I love how in his placemaking practice, Loos used very simple materials and sort of an echo of a traditional way of decoration to create a sense of space and of place that elevates this room above the white box it began as.
What's really compelling to me is that, of course, all these examples are of famous art collectors. And here, within the walls of TEFAF, we're really completely focused on the art collecting, but in fact, we work with many more people interior decorators such as yourself, but also sometimes corporate clients. And that's why I think it's really interesting to look at this through the prism of Rosewood and your design philosophy. And therefore, I'd like to start with you explaining to us a little bit more how it is that we draw inspirations from those interiors that are so deeply linked to the individuals who created them. But then in practice, you have to create kind of a charter of values to assess how you build your own new hotels or how you deal with your historic properties. Can you bring to life for us what the, I guess, Rosewood placemaking philosophy is?
Yes, I mean, for us at Rosewood, I mean, the hotel is this sort of living, breathing sort of space, and I think it's somewhat easy in a way. For example, this is an image of one of the bars that we have in one of our other properties. Unfortunately, we don't have photos of Rosewood Amsterdam to show you as we're busy sort of preparing for the opening. But just to give you some ideas of the philosophy of how we layer art, contemporary and traditional, but also in a hotel space, where you have F&B spaces, bars and restaurants, there's an opportunity to infuse that the placemaking philosophy into the concept, the menu, and down to the wardrobe of our associates. Really sort of infusing that into every single element, into the service philosophy as well. So this is an example of some private dining rooms we have in some of our restaurants, where it really tells the story of the legacy of the owners and really imparting sort of personal sort of snippets of history through objects and through books and through artifacts as well. And also, I think down to every element, even the housekeeping moments in some of our spaces where we have artworks in the bedrooms, but I think in the next image you'll see that there is a photo, there is a small book of the works of an artist called William Lowe, and there's a painting kind of on the other side of the room. But this little shelf next to the bed, the housekeepers, for example, at Turndown Service, it's a book of the paintings of his work. So every day, a small moment of surprise where maybe it's turned to another page that speaks to something else, so that there is this living, breathing element of the curation of a space, which I think is really, a wonderful opportunity in a hotel. I don't know if there are other images, but yes. And again, I think the philosophy is to really the direction that hotels, especially the sort of perception of luxury today, we believe is not the sort of, we're moving away from the sort of old ideas of these grandiose sort of spaces, but really connecting to storytelling to kind of bring it down to human scale. And again, most importantly, about human connection and bringing together community and offering sort of moments and touch points of storytelling, because I think you can have all these facts about building a place and all these elements, but I think it's really that storytelling element that really brings things to life, that allow people to connect with the elements of those things, but also with each other.
But therefore, for example, for Rosewood Amsterdam, that you've been following the design of closely, I assume, do you source specific objects that you've identified as being part of the local story you want to bring to the fore? Do you search for antiques, or is it mostly based on a design studio who builds things for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think first and foremost, from the very sort of beginning stages of any property, we look really at our collaborative partners. So in this case, with Pete Bone, with our consultants, it's really bringing together who's going to tell the most compelling story and who's going to do it in a way that we haven't seen it before. And so, again, when it comes down to the pieces, yes, that's sort of towards the end of the process. But I think in the beginning, really selecting the right collaborators, and we all bring this to life as a team, and to align first on that mindset of, what is the story we want to tell? What is that tone that we want to set? What is the message we want to bring?
So in fact, the objects, you say, come at the end, they're the finishing touch to have the full stop of that storyline for you.
Yes, absolutely. I think the objects, the art, the furniture, the finishes, it's really that expression of that vision that we set together at the beginning to say, this this is the story that we want to tell with Rosewood Amsterdam. This is how we want people to feel. These are the surprises and the moments of joy that we want people to encounter.
It's interesting maybe to go to Francis's images then. I don't know if it's only your homes in Valletta or if it's different homes that you shared with us. But
today I decided only to share my own homes rather than other people's homes. So I can reflect a bit on my story. And actually this photograph is my dining room in Valletta. The house is from the 18th century. Part of it was earlier, but it was remodeled then. And Valletta is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The house took me about 5 years to do the restorations after the Second World War. And there's a great influence from St. John's Co-Cathedral, which is an important cathedral in Europe because it has the largest Caravaggio he ever painted. And he actually is the only one he ever signed in his own blood. It's a very torturous painting of the beheading of St. John. And Valletta is very much a place where, even during the Knights of St. John, they were alert to take Caravaggio in when he was running away from scandal so that they could commission new works of art. Because they were, let's just say, very in touch with commissioning works from Reuben tapestries to silver to vestments. And so when I started decorating this house, I thought I must not be in fear of the future and what's current. And traditionally in a dining room like this, you would have grand chandeliers, but instead I went to an LA-based artist called Jorge Pardo. I brought him to Malta and I said, let's do two art sculptures. Let's not make chandeliers. It was a signature of the house, and you'll see it in another room coming on, because I felt like the ceilings, because they were originally painted. There was a Lady Strickland who'd removed all the painted ceilings. And during the Second World War, Valletta was more bombed than London was in the Blitz, but this house survived. And unfortunately, you can't see this room, but this room, the ceiling is by Daniel Boren. So he painted the ceiling for me in stripes and mirrors. So we created a new artwork on the ceiling. And the paintings on the walls here were commissioned by a young up-and-coming Spanish artist at the time, which is Secundino Hernandez. And he again was commissioned, he came to Malta to paint. And I think with all the things about being supportive of art and design, I've learned, like, going back to Pierre Bergé and Yves Saint Laurent, one mustn't be afraid of commissioning and embarking on creating yourself. It's a philosophy I've given to all my clients, that let's make pieces which will be historical pieces in the future. In this room, for instance, we have a lot of work by Mattia Bonetti. The table on the left is an amazing bronze, silver-plated, 1-ton table of bronze that needed to be craned into the room. And the lamps in the corners were designed by Mattia Bonetti, again being inspired by the Oriental, because Valletta, like Venice, like Istanbul, Constantinople, were trading places as well. And I think for me, every home I've decorated, every project I do, mine or for other people, you have to feel, is this the place now? Does it feel like you're entering that place? Are you in Valletta? And for me, Valletta has this Orientalist feel, and it has this elegance of a walled city. But I wanted to make it relevant. There are antiques in the house. I have things from my late mother. I mean, she was fascinated with blackamoors. Blackamoors today are not so well considered, but she, at the time, was fascinated by them and their memories. And there's beautiful 18th century antiques, but they're scattered, because for me, this project was about living now in Valletta, and I wanted to show people locally, to not be afraid of contemporary art, to embrace contemporary design. And I wanted to make a statement to where I'm from, bringing the new while restoring the old, which is also super important, to take care of the heritage. And so now this house, because of my work as well in Malta with arts and culture, we use this house a lot to entertain, visiting artists. I've been working for 7 years on the new Contemporary Art Museum, which has a great educational program. And this house has been the hub. It's like, I'm very teased about this. I was saying, if we've got a new artist coming, This is where they come. We do a dinner for them, a party for them, and it's got energy. And I think you can decorate historically and you can decorate for now, but always it has to have relevance for where it is, the history of the space, and the character of the people who live there. I think that's the essence for me.
And of course, these are so merged because, for instance, the reference image you shared of Berger and Yves Saint Laurent, which today for us epitomizes the 20th century Parisian interior, they made it the iconic Parisian interior. There's no one defining architectural feature that actually places you more or less there. It's really thanks to their passion and their talent in bringing objects together. How long did it take you to undertake this project?
Well, the whole project from beginning to end, because Valletta is a very difficult city to do construction because the roads are narrow, and between the archaeological department, between the planning authorities, it took about 5 years to restore the buildings. And commissioning all the pieces inside took in total nearly 8 years because artists are busy. Also, I wanted to gauge and feel what was right. And also I had to budget. So, it's like, I can't do everything in one time. So it's always a process. But then but that's also the part of collecting. It's lovely to add things and layer things as you go along. I don't think a home is ever finished because you always fall in love with something else. And when you fall in love, it's important to be able to add that into your collection. And I think that's what I always say to people. There is a group of people who think everything should be finished and that's it. I'm of the philosophy where it's ever evolving. We have to always reinvent ourselves. Our eyes must always travel and see new things and enjoy. That's why, like when I come to TEFAF, I discover things that my eye never used to understand when I was younger. As I grow older now, my taste develops, and I challenge myself to look at movements and decoration, and really understand the beauty of it. And for me, it's very educational. And then I find myself passionate about something I was never passionate about.
Yeah.
And I want to learn about it, and I want a bit of it to be mine. That's also the other bad thing about being into collecting. You become rather obsessive about wanting more and more things, which is good and bad. But it keeps us all super busy. But yes, but Valletta for me it was very much about trying to, even on a local situation, to my Maltese friends and people I work with there, to show them. You don't always just have to have antiques. You can embrace the contemporary.
You're staking a claim for the futurity of Malta when you do that. I love that. It's wonderful to restore a property, but if you leave it trapped in amber, it doesn't speak to a continuing life and to continuing relevance, as you said. I find something almost therapeutic about Francis's approach because, in our world, there are some who like to be siloed in history, and they don't want to address the contemporary. There are also those who want to be siloed within the modern and contemporary and who are afraid of the past. And this approach that sort of blends them heedlessly and in a way that evolves over time is actually so much more relaxed. I think of Berger and Yves Saint Laurent in the same way. There's something ever evolving about the practice, so you as a person are allowed to evolve within it.
Exactly, and you can embrace every chapter. I mean, I do historical work, and I'm doing another home for me, which belongs to the National Trust in England, which was the former house of John Fowler, the Prince of British Decorating, and the narrative for that is completely different to what I'm doing here. It's about embracing the past and paying homage to the man with Nancy Lancaster and Sybil Colfax, who created the British country house style, which was embraced by America.
Oh, it certainly was.
And the thing is, this is why everything has its challenges, and I've had to embrace floral wallpaper in a big way. I mean, I never would have dreamed that I would be now falling in love with floral wallpapers. But that's the beauty of it. You're always evolving, and you're looking at things of beauty, wherever they come from, and then you mix it with something new, or you work with the vintage. It's beautiful to be able to be free, I think. in how you see things.
Agreed.
And much like what you're saying, so we're not just talking about mixing old with new, but mixing old with new with old with new with old with new. We also hear, myself and my fellow exhibitors, learn so much from people like yourself, from the collectors, from the visitors, because we come to TEFAF with assumptions that this thing will sell to this kind of person, and invariably we're surprised. And sometimes we get into conversations where, you know, a new client comes and explains to us why they want this specific thing and how it fits into their own house or home or sense of place. And when we're lucky or fortunate enough to visit them and to see those objects into context we could have never ourselves imagined, it's very moving. And of course, sometimes some of them have you know, a very diverse kind of minimalistic approach, or like you, they fall into collecting that kind of bug or disease, and then they can't really recover ever from this. And I guess, Michael, you're very well placed also to talk about this, because in your book, The New Antiquarians, you showcase interiors that are extremely varied from people mostly in the New York region, or is it all North America? I can't...
Mostly North America, a few in the UK. The book was meant to be international in scope, but then we started it in the first week of March 2020. So I'm afraid it became an exploration of my home region. You know, when I entered the antiques world about 15 years ago, there was incredible sadness and bitterness around what many have framed as the sort of collapse of the antiques market in the US. You know, in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, that market boomed. And it was both a context where connoisseur collectors created incredible collections, but it was also true that, at least in New York, where I'm basing my perspective from, there was some social pressure to collect. I mean, one of the ways that you could position yourself in high society, which has also since collapsed, but at the time, was to collect the right things. And there was a sort of competitiveness to collecting that may or may not have been a positive influence on human beings, but it ensured some stickiness for antiques in the lives of these people. I mean, they had a reason to go to them, even if they didn't love antiques. And that had really waned. I mean, I think it began, you know, in the very early 2000s. 9/11 did not help in America, and then the financial crash came, and that market was really soft. And so, you know, dealers, curators, seasoned collectors thought, after a couple of years of that, young people are not interested. I mean, we all know Gen X decided to sort of focus on contemporary art en masse. They also helped crack open the market for mid-century modern, which is a wonderful contribution. But the antiques establishment couldn't really see mid-century modern through the lens of continuity at first. They saw it as disruptive. And so when I encountered, you know, antiques fairs and dealers for the first time, there was just incredible pessimism about the future of the market and of the future for material culture. But at the very same time, I was noticing that millennials, who had not yet come into their buying power, but who had Pinterest boards and Tumblr accounts and Instagram accounts, were looking at and loving the material culture of the past. They were loving color and pattern. You know, they were wearing Gucci when Michele was there. It was sort of this moment where I could see these are not minimalists. They may not have the funds to begin collecting at the scale we would like to see, but they're coming. And so my book was both an attempt to help, you know, a wider antiques community see what was happening with young collectors, and it was also meant to be a sort of siren call to young people who have these proclivities that you too should collect. Mm-hmm. And what's been incredible to me is that since this book went into production in 2019, this is old hat. We've seen interiors like this being presented in shelter magazines. We've seen more and more of them flood the internet in spaces like Instagram, and nothing could make me happier. You know, that the book is in a way becoming less and less rare in what it pictures, because young collectors really are beginning to take up the practice, and it's beginning to have an effect on the market. Not always at the level of this fair, but, you know, in smaller antiques shows, in auctions, we're seeing that generation begin to pick up the mantle. And my message for our friends here is that they're coming. And as they matriculate up to into their buying power, I think we'll see them here. And there will be a wave of collectors that is much larger than the one that we saw with Gen X. So it's exciting. And I think an optimistic moment for the world of beauty and material culture. This is clearly a home in the UK. So this is one of the few British photo shoots, and it's the home in Deal near the seaside in Kent of Pablo Bronstein, the artist, who of course loves history, and his work is deeply rooted in it, and in some ways a sort of playful postmodern dialogue with especially the Rococo and Baroque sort of idioms of the 18th century. And there's a sort of tradition of interpreting and displaying historic material here that you can see being demonstrated, but there's also playfulness that feels new. And this is a sort of taped together interior, very kind of Mongiardino in terms of its construction, because this is an artist working on a limited budget, trying to create a look and trying to create a beautiful sort of container for the objects he collects, but on a budget.
Well, I have my shot of optimism for the day, so I feel much better.
I love it. My mission accomplished.
But it's true what this evokes to me, because I was at first a little confused about the concept of placemaking, in as much as it is about designing something rooted in the local context, but that's not just what it means to me. And when I see something like this, it's also individuals allowing their own taste to create their surrounding.
That's it.
And not falling into the trap of homogeneity, or let's say the easy solution kind of.
I love that you say that in response to this, because when Pablo bought this place, there was a shaker effect kitchen installed in it. So the historic aspects of the room were intact, but they were all sort of painted white. I mean, we've all seen that before. And along one of the walls was a very dreary line of cabinets from IKEA. So, he really did have to remove that expression of homogeneity and borrowed taste in order to instantiate his own in the space in this sort of ribald way. And, kind of returning to hotels, I feel like at the Rosewood and beyond, this shift from attempting to create a sort of corporate homogeneity across properties to shifting into a contextualist mode where each property might have the sort of tropes or rituals that you've come to love as a guest at Rosewood, but each location is trying to respond to a local context. I think it's the same with collectors. It's the same where you're talking about Malta versus England.
Yes.
Your approaches are different.
Of course. You see, when in London, you want to feel like in London. I think there was a slide of the London thing before here. And you have to be, so that's the main, yes. So this is the dining room, which has a wonderful Flora Jakonovic painting, who has two beautiful paintings right now in the Wallace collection. And she did a time in Venice and reinterpreting Titian paintings. So they're abstract forms of what you find, in churches and palaces in Italy. But her recontextualizes the fact in her narrative about the beauty. But it's her identity as a woman artist is incredible. Mm-hmm. But then on the other wall, I had Mattia Bonetti create this mirror, for the space, because I wanted something that's completely in the way Baroque, but of today, and you're in this Georgian architecture. But you see, the radiator covers, for instance, are actually hidden in those metal shapes under the candelabras, because as it's grade 1 listed, we were not allowed to hang a chandelier. So we had to put these 4 candelabras in each corner to light the dining room. But also, it never had heating, the apartment, so we actually needed to put radiators. So I had to, okay, one piece by an artist does both lighting and heat.
Incredible.
So that's what happened there. But it's all about the context of where you are. And actually, in Britain, artists and designers, and actually just decorations comes quite naturally. The British style comes through. And, it's really interesting to see Pablo's work, because that room is like a living watercolor of what he does.
Precisely.
He's interpreted his own artistry in how he lives.
Absolutely. And another detail about his lifestyle is that he collects objects that serve as models and references for his sort of pastiches and for his capricci of, sort of 18th century material culture. So he's creating an interior that looks like his work. Then as he moves through the interior, he's drawing it and he's creating another expression. It's fascinating.
Well, I guess the conclusion of this at all sides of the conversation, the private or the public interior, is that we're lucky to live in a little moment where there's more allowance for the unexpected,
Yes.
right? The surprise. That's what you were saying at the very beginning, that it even trickles down to your hospitality teams. It's not just about the interior. The interior becomes a continuation of the experience of the guest or the person who lives in one of those wonderful rooms. I think this only brushes the surface of what placemaking is today. I hope everyone has a better idea of this concept, but I suppose to me, what it really means is allow for difference, allow for cultural and contextual difference, and just for what you love. And I don't know if you want to add anything, or if we can open up the floor for questions.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing that, I mean, of course, we've looked at examples of private residential interiors, but I think what's interesting with a hotel is, while there might not be the sort of private client, I think it's interesting to explore also the city. And in the case of Rosewood Amsterdam, you have the Palace of Justice with its own history and all the things that happened within it, but also celebrating the city of Amsterdam and that particular part of the city, and all of these things and juxtapositions, and trying to kind of capture a spirit, again, not trying to capture something that is frozen in time, but a spirit of something that can be both sort of formal and rebellious, creative, but also have a sort of sense of order, and trying to then express that in a contemporary way that's relevant, that'll sort of take existing building, kind of forward, and then bringing it to life with service and programming and people as well. I think is something that's very interesting.
And so, can you remind us when Rosewood Amsterdam opens?
It'll be in a few weeks in May. Yeah.
Okay, well, congratulations in advance. I hope we can all go and visit that. Thank you so much. Please help me thank our panelists, and then we'll move on to any questions the audience may have.
Don't be shy. We're very friendly.
Yeah. Oh, good.
Thank you. As someone whose area of specialty is not interior design, I'm still curious to know, when did this new trend start? Could you tell us more of the background of when did the modern and the past became eligible for collision and blend? Thank you.
Well, what do we think, Michael?
Do you want to split that one?
We can split that one up more. Yeah, exactly. I think it's been evolving slowly. But like you said, like from when your book came out, I think it's a progression, because I think it's also more of a generational thing, in my view, with people now, let's say, not to really give ages, but 40s, 50s, being much more affluent, being able to do it, but actually gauging the past and understanding it, but gauging the new and wanting to be relevant. I don't know how you feel about it, but for me, it's how it is.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I would sort of tell two histories here. In the 20th century, in the second half of the 20th century, I think we had some great exemplars, as you've shown us, for what this eclectic, layered interior that incorporates fine and decorative arts can look like in a sort of freer expression. And so, I think that for any of the younger, and again, I would say 40s and 50s sort of private clients who are working in this manner today, their mood board certainly contains, the interior that you showed, the interiors of the great Italian decorator Renzo Mongiardino, and others who had this very eclectic sensibility and who always thought about sort of the history of beauty in a very open way, as opposed to in an academic manner. I think that that influence has grown and grown, especially since the turn of the century. And what I always point out is that the other history here is the history of the internet. I mean, so much in our world has changed since the late 90s. And why is that? It's the internet. It's everything. It's politics. It's the way we consume information. It's the way we think about visual culture. And now we are inundated by so much imagery every day from all through history that I think it's just hard to stay trapped in one idiom or one style. You want variety. The eye wants to travel, but it does now, almost without our permission, because we're exposed to so much. And so I think that living in this ultimate plurality of influence and style through the ages has kind of trained or retrained us to have an increasingly open-minded approach to how past and present can be combined. If you're a collector with houses in different localities, I think now more than ever, you're interested in those each being contextually specific, but also vessels for different collecting practices you may have, because you pick up new ones along the way. So, I think this sort of generation that we've been describing has been empowered over the years by having sort of access to more information and more influence from across time. But I think that's true for all of us. And I think that, if you build something and fill it with a collection all at once, it might look fantastic for a time, but you will tire of it and you will want to evolve it. So, if you have unlimited means, by all means, create a Gesamtkunstwerk and then stamp out others as your budget allows. But for those of us who have a sort of living practice, I think it's enormously compelling to think, wow, even if I have one interior, I can just start evolving it from today. And it will go through more contemporary expressions and more, expressions that are more deeply rooted in history. But because there's not a rule book and we have access to all of this, why not live in the fullness of that opportunity?
And there are so many different points to this answer to try to really pinpoint where the change comes, but also from the market side, kind of counterintuitively. Big estate sales of collectors who of a certain age who passed away also draw a lot of influence, even though their taste may have been deemed that of the past. So recently, for instance, there was a for sale auction of the Givenchy collection in Paris. There was the Anne Getty sales in New York. And when you get this multitude of artworks surrounded around one single person's taste, mixed with what you describe as, of course, the internet influence and the fact that this, ends up on everyone's screen. In my work, that helps really create kind of a dynamism.
Yes.
So it's really interesting. And then you have a door handle that ends up doing 20 times its estimate because it comes with the passion that someone put into collecting it. So it's really a multitude of factors that bring back this cyclical taste for the mix that, in our opinion, in the, let's say, more art historical sense, never disappeared, just comes and goes and comes and goes.
And, when people are sort of suspicious of this narrative or they're skeptical about it, that all of these old things come back around, I think stranger things happen every day, right? We're on a floating rock and the condition of our survival is that there's this big hydrogen bomb that's going off in the sky that we call the sun. So life is already statistically improbable. And so therefore Tiffany lamps can come back. Right? And they are. Right now, they're very, very hip among the sort of downtown set in New York. And what event happened starting about a year and a half ago? The Anne Getty sales. And what was in those sales? Tiffany lamps.
Yes, and their values are going back up because at one point in the 90s, they were very desirable.
They were.
And they went out of fashion. So things do go in and out of fashion. But it's absolutely right. The Instagram and things like this have changed our lives because we open and we see so much information. even as a designer, sometimes I'm bombarded by what I see, that, you know, there's so many trends, so many ideas, but also so many connections now to the past.
Yes,
Lots
that's
of
it.
young people are posting pictures from 20th century interiors,
Yes.
even going as far as the 1970s when I was born, which is vintage
They're
now.
massive. The
But, you know,
70s are
the
massive.
70s are in again, you know? It's cool.
So are the 90s.
Yeah.
I mean, I hate to say it, but probably the chief touchstone in fashion right now is the 90s. And 90s interiors are also being surfaced by these sort of influencers who are shirtless. And it's like, why are you showing me an archival photo from the 90s of an interior? You know, it's a bit discomforting sometimes to see who is surfacing that imagery. But really, design is one of the chief hobbies, I would say, or sort of forms of self-expression for Gen Z. It's an obsession. And so, you know, this will impact our lives and the market.
Who else wants a metaphysical answer here?
Sorry about that.
I'm not sure about metaphysical, but thank you, all three of you, for wonderful presentations and some beautiful images. I'm a conservator, so I deal with not only paintings, but historic interiors as a historical representation of style in the past. And I love some of this fusion that you've got here, where you're mixing new style in with old. But can you tell us a little bit about how that process goes through? Because often rooms have changed in style and color over time. And as a conservator of historic interiors, we often do what we call color research.
Yes.
And we look at elements of different tones and shades in the room and try to bring that back to life again. So I'm just wondering how you see that as creating these new spaces.
Well, I think this one's coming at me. Actually, there's an important slide before this one. No, the other way. This room. So this is the Blue Salon at Albany, my home in London, which was actually the Duke of Melbourne's house on Piccadilly. And it's the only surviving William Chambers ceiling left in the whole of the mansion. And the watercolor of this is actually at the V&A. And when I was doing the research of the room, because the famous owner before me was Fleur Coles, the American socialite. So she lived here until she died at over 100 years old. I hope it's going to give a good legacy to everybody who lives in this apartment. But what's really interesting, in Fleur's time, when she bought it post-war, her blues were quite strong in a way, and there was only one shade of blue, and the stucco was in white. But when we did our archaeology on the paint, we found that there were 3 shades of blue used originally by Chambers, and the white was actually pale pink. So going into the history of it was really important, and we went back to the original colours. And what was very interesting about historical homes in England, for instance, these walls are actually covered in canvas, and they were stuck with rabbit glue. And because it's Georgian and it's because it's grade 1 listed, we did the same exact process to be true, to have this feeling of not completely perfect walls, which for most today would be considered not right. But when you're conserving the past, you have to be true to the method and really as true as much to the background. And of course, for me, when you look at the contemporary art, there's a Baslitz there in the corner. This blue is quite an intense color, but you can't be afraid. The Georgians were not afraid of color.
It.
They loved color. Today, we're so afraid of color.
Well, we were, but this is
Now
a
it's
great new
coming back.
antiquarians topic, because you know the famous case of Colonial Williamsburg in America, where in the 20th century, everyone was obsessed with a color palette that was inaccurate, because all of these dusty mauves and blues were not a result of our modern paint analysis. They were based on visual evidence, and those colors had been exposed to centuries of smoke and environmental factors that made them very muted. So, by the time we get to the turn of the 21st century, there are some very conservative views in America about what the right colors are for a historic interior. And as it turns out, they were completely inaccurate. And what history had in store for us was much stranger and much more colorful and surprising than what we thought. And the sort of new antiquarians I'm talking about are really much more in dialogue with that legacy of color that comes out of historic paint analysis, rather than with those correct institutional views that people held before. And I think one of the fun things about the past when you're speaking to younger people is that it's full of surprises, because every radical idea, every surprising color, every novel formal notion existed in the past. And so the more we dig into what it really was, the more access we have to fun and radical ideas. And I think people are open to those now in a way that they weren't quite before.
Open to learning and discovering.
And to saying, oh, wow, so those rooms were turquoise, let's do it. You know, as opposed to being kind of taken aback because, you know, if you're a connoisseur collector in New York in 2005, your rooms are beige because that's a good backdrop for your art. No. We want to see the color that, you know, might have existed in 1785.
Yeah, and they were really brave with their colors. I mean, all over Europe. I mean, their color was important. Gilding was important. There was a richness, and it had energy. And I think we went through the time of beige. And I think now, even looking at historical work, history reveals that color was always there.
Yes.
And it's just like some people are brave enough to take it on now.
Yeah.
There's still there's still always a mixed situation, but I think, you know, a room tells you which color it should be. And actually, very interesting, John Fowler, and I've been discovering this now, doing a lot of work on his history of paint work with George Oakes. When he was looking at restoring National Trust properties after the war, and it was a big case, he was never dictated only by the color he saw there. It's about what his gut told him is the color. And it was strength. There was a color purpose there. And I think, you know, it's now something that people embrace. We see a lot more color online.
Yeah.
It shows, it shines.
It's true.
Do we have a last question before wrapping up? There.
Now, looking into the future, would you say that the historic, or rather the new and the ever-evolving, has more relevance, or is there going to be an equilibrium? What do you think?
Shall we all give an answer to that? I see, let's call it an equilibrium. I hope that we have an equilibrium in the future in all respects. I think we'll see more plurality. So I think that whatever your taste is, whatever your eye alights upon, you can have that now. And I think that we're not going to see a dominant style or trend dictating what you're supposed to do. It's much more now about the journey, as you were saying earlier, of discovering your own taste and accepting that it's going to be a journey from, you know, one affinity to another with a lot of learning and mistakes and trial by error and victories along the way, especially for collectors. I'm already seeing actually a group of younger people who are very influenced by 20th century design, but not in the sort of, let's say, buttoned up manner of the international style, but there's a lot of sort of interest in some of the thornier edges of 20th century modernism creeping in right now. And it's creating sort of a wave of interiors that look very different from the ones in the book. In fact, the second volume will reflect this new look that I'm describing that's less colorful, but it's very, very full of objects. And so, you know, I would say this story never stops. I mean, there is still this wave of color coming at us, as we just discussed, but even within that, I'm seeing a group of younger people who are decorating with a little less color. They actually love drapery on the walls. There's a lot of, like, in New York right now, there are a lot of people just draping their rooms with ivory, a lot like Los, ivory fabrics, and then putting historic art and 20th century design against that backdrop. So I see more of this sort of dynamic discussion ahead. And I'm so glad of it, because it would be really boring to be trapped in one idiom.
Absolutely, yeah. I think we use the word eclectic a lot. I think, you know, as with people, we're all multi-dimensional. We have different moods. We have different sort of things that we like, and we evolve and we change. And I think when we look at design and we say that, you know, we want things to be timeless. We don't want it to be responding to a certain trend or of a certain period. But I think that timelessness to me is achieved through that eclecticism. It's not just one look or one thing. It's a little bit of this and it's a little bit of that, and it reflects your character. And the culmination of all these things create that timelessness, because it's not just of one specific moment in your perspective or in your time.
I think we're creating a new history where we're looking at the past in a more relevant way, looking at the future in a more important way, and being free about it, and creating something that everybody feels freedom, because it actually comes to a point now where we have so much information to inspire us that we get it from all over. And this is what's creating the look we have now, which is actually, in a way, not ever happened in history the way it has. And that is because we have an added vehicle of what's on the social media. And that has changed from referencing from books in the past. And it's really creating the style that we see now, which is, in different parts of the world, it's slightly different because the demographics and what people like is different. And I think that's why it's free. And it's actually the most exciting, like for me, it's ever been now.
And it's all happening on the floor at TEFAF.
Indeed it is.
Well, thank you so much for so much positivity and enthusiasm. I bet we're all going to sell out today then. Please thank our great panelists.